Technical Assistance Center. Oh, this is going to be recorded. On our community of practice on engaging fathers and father figures. I'm Pamela Trivedi. I'm the infant and early childhood transformation team lead for our center, and I'm just really excited to be offering the opportunity for us to engage with our speaker today. We decided to, based on your feedback from some of the other sessions, we decided to not use formal slides. So whoever has the ability to turn on their camera, it would be great for us to have a little bit more interaction. And I'm not going to say a lot about our center other than we provide training opportunities, and kind of we're developing learning opportunities on the early childhood team, so towards building infant and early childhood systems of care. So we're really excited to get your feedback on what would help you move forward in your work. And I know we send you links to surveys all the time, but we really do read that and look for your feedback. Just a quick word about security issues, just because on some of our events, we've had some issues with Zoom bombing. If there's any security issues during the session, we'll stop the session immediately and we'll get you the content somehow. There'll be instructions to get the rest of the content. So I want to just kind of move through our content quickly here. Thanks everyone for coming back, and if we have any new folks, welcome. As I said, I'm really excited to have the opportunity for you to connect and hear more about the work of our speaker. Ricky Traynor is a very good colleague. He has some great experience as both a local leader in early childhood intervention who's worked on the city level in Milwaukee, and has done a lot of great work in home visitation and in Milwaukee County's Healthy Start program. And Ricky, the state is lucky that Ricky has just moved to the state level in his work. Ricky also has some great clinical training in social work and just a broad range of really excellent community-based experience. Every time I have spoken to Ricky in the context of early childhood work, I've really learned a lot. And he has some excellent expertise about engaging special populations, such as families who are new immigrants or refugees, parenting teens, and family members who are non-binary and identify as male. So, without further ado, I would love to turn it over to Ricky so we could hear more about his work. Ricky, could you start off with telling us about how you came to this work, kind of at the intersection of fatherhood and early childhood?
So thank you for that introduction. I entered into fatherhood work through just my general social work practice. I started as lead care manager with a managed care unit, providing field services for adults with developmental disabilities or that are engaged in long-term care waiver programs in Racine and Kenosha County. And then I continued my social work practice as a human service worker who actually evaluated individuals using a long-term care functional screen for Medicaid eligibility. And then I got a call from the City of Milwaukee Health Department to become a public health social worker in their fatherhood program called the Direct Assistance for Dads, or DAD project. And so for 4 years, I was a public health social worker and then supervisor with the DADS project. And the DADS project essentially worked with anyone that identified as male and had a child under the age of 1. Okay, so from 0 to 1. So I worked with refugees, asylees, undocumented, documented, naturalized immigrants. I worked with individuals that identified as male that would engage in paternal parenting, which I'll go into a lot more, I'll explain a lot more later on, as well as just at-risk populations, underserved populations in general, because focusing on fatherhood in early childhood intervention is a novel concept. And so all of the fathers that I worked with, I had to work with them from a grassroots perspective. Mostly just pulling their resources, understanding the difference between a father that is a provider versus a father that is a nurturer, understanding the difference between a dead broke dad and a deadbeat dad, right? And understanding that they can choose how to parent their child because parenting is intentional. and use the model in our curriculums like 24/7 Dad, Nurturing Fathers, and Parents as Teachers to encourage and empower all types of fathers that I had the privilege of working with in the city of Milwaukee.
Thank you so much. That's a really helpful introduction to your work. So I know that one thing that we've had the chance to talk a lot about, Ricky, is what you see as the difference between maternal and paternal parenting. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that in the field, this always looks different. There's different types of parenting styles. They're based on background, based on how you were parented, based on social expectation and cultural norms. But ultimately, what we find is that they fall into two categories: maternal parenting and paternal parenting. Maternal parenting really focuses on cultivating the individual self, building your own self-confidence in your perspective of the world, and kind of treating the world like you are the center of it, right? It comes from the concept of you were in the womb, your mother is the center of your world, and so therefore you are connected to that center and you don't deviate from that center even after birth, right? And that's largely conducted by women, which is why we label it as maternal parenting. And so this maternal parenting style really builds self-confidence, really helps you maintain a high level of internal validation. And because it's typically seen in individuals that identify as female, that's why we label it as maternal. And I say that because it doesn't necessarily need to be the mom or the biological mother or the adopted mother or even a woman. Right? It's just a way of looking at parenting and an instinctual way to engage with the child and help them thrive throughout the lifespan. And then the other type, the second type that we kind of see all of types, is paternal. And again, we label it as paternal because we largely see this done by individuals who identify as male. And those individuals engage in the type of parenting that prepares you for the world at large, right? That allows you to take that internal validation and take it out to the external world, right? That helps you build trust and trusting relationships and understand interpersonal dynamics. A good example of this type of parenting is when you have a child that essentially does a trust jump, right? So they're on the top of the jungle gym and they jump off and you catch them, right? So there's a period of fear there where they're afraid. They know you, they recognize you. And they trust you, so they jump, right? And then you catch them, right? And so that's an example of the type of parenting that a person that identifies as male will typically engage in, and that is why we call it paternal parenting. And in the field, this looks differently, right? This looks different based on their social cultural identity. They will adapt this parenting style to fit that environment, whether it be lower class, middle class, upper middle class, upper class, right? And so they will make it sociologically relevant, both the maternal and the paternal parenting style.
Thank you for kind of explaining that and using some examples from your work. I think it's a helpful frame of reference. And I just wanted to note that I think kind of thinking through those styles and the sort of the unique contributions of the paternal style is really a theme we've been talking about throughout our work together in the COP. So I know that in your career, you've done a lot to sort of highlight the value of both of those approaches.
And in terms of child development, they complement each other, right? Males and females have been parenting children so long as our species has existed, right? So parenting means that they have taken responsibilities in the overall care of a child, right? So they've instinctually developed ways to display that and to represent that. And again, there's cultural norms and sociological expectations that mold and guide that, but ultimately it falls into those two categories based on your identity and how you identify within that society. But they do complement each other and they benefit the child and they help the child become a more well-rounded individual, right? So they don't become too in need of external validation, and they don't become too secured, right? Too self-confident to the expense of other people and themselves, ultimately.
It's really good points about balance. So I think that one thing that a lot of us who work directly with children and families, have been trying to figure out as the definition of family has changed and become more expansive, and also as kind of roles for people in families have been changing. And you mentioned kind of sociological and cultural changes. I think a lot of us are trying to figure out how to work with family members who identify as male and maybe had not necessarily been born biologically as male, and sort of how do you incorporate individuals with that kind of identification into fatherhood work and groups that are designed for fathers.
Mhm. Yeah, so if you identify as a father, it's important to establish a baseline, right? We always want to establish a baseline no matter what we do, because that's kind of how we understand how to move forward, right? And when we're creating interventions to support family well-being, it's no different, right? So with the father that you're working with, whether if they identify as male, whether they biologically are male or whether they've transitioned or whatnot, if they identify as male, I would encourage and empower that. Because chances are, if they identify as male and they intend to father a child, they will engage in paternal parenting. And so you would want to observe how they parent, right? Because they might still parent in a maternal sort of way, which is fine. Because I've worked with individuals that identify as male that have engaged in maternal parenting and paternal parenting. So it's important to understand what perspective of parenting they're typically engaging in. And so once you do that, and if you identify that it is a paternal style, then you support that style, right? You reinforce their decision making, you inform their decision making when it's insecure, and you do everything in your power to focus all of the parent-child interaction and the development-centered parenting on establishing and maintaining secure attachments, because just like in our work, trust is essential. It also is essential to both paternal and maternal parenting, but specifically paternal, because it requires you to, because they're showing the child how the world functions and what type of trusting relationships are out there in the world. And if you are inconsistent, or you're not predictable, you're not reliable, and you're not consistent, then that is a message that you're giving that child's brain architecture that the world at large is the same, right? It's unpredictable, it's unsafe, and they need to protect themselves from it. And that's why we see a lot of issues with social emotional development in children when the maternal and paternal parenting styles fail to establish that necessary and needed trust. And I would say that fathers are tasked with that more, merely because of the social and cultural expectations of fatherhood. So to bring it back, for individuals that identify as male, I would first try to understand their parenting style, right? And then if they do parenting style they use, support and encourage and empower that parenting style based on your observations, based on that baseline that you have observed.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with that. I'm sure a lot of other participants, and we're going to use breakout rooms today, so we'll have a chance to dig more into some of the special populations that you all have worked with. But I'm sure other folks have important things to share about working with folks who identify as male or are non-binary. I know that Ricky, I know that in your work in Milwaukee, there was a lot of specific outreach toward the refugee populations that live in Milwaukee. Could you talk a little bit about some of those populations and ways that your programs at Healthy Start and Home Visiting targeted fatherhood work for those specific populations, which are comprised of different cultural groups?
Yeah, it first required a lot of cultural awareness, understanding what refugee culture is, right? Understanding what a VOLAG is or what a resettlement agency is, the difference between a refugee and an asylee. What is the route of what is the refugee's path to naturalization, right? How long the 5 to 10 years they need to stay in the refugee camp, and what happens in these camps, and how does that influence their experience before they even come to the United States? How did they get placed in this specific region, in this specific area? And what, like, all of the case management that's required for that population before you even walk into the home, right? It's important for you to understand this path and this journey originally, and understand the culture, again, before you even start providing interventions or starting your case management. And so once you come with this base of just general knowledge, then you can apply it to your specific clients and look at what their agenda is. The fathers that I've worked with who are refugees, their primary concern beyond maintaining housing, having a job, and just overall family well-being was that they were disciplining differently than what America expects, right? Because the populations that I worked with were from all over the country, but they believed that if a child did something wrong, you have to punish them, right? You have to punish them in order so that they don't do it again, so that they learn the lesson, so that they can contribute to society. And I've heard it from many different refugees that they realize that there is a different expectation in America, right? That we believe in positive discipline, right? And that discipline means learning and teaching, not punishing, right? And this comes as a huge culture shock on top of all the other culture shocks that come with being in America. And they're worried that they're going to do something that, because a lot of the refugees that I worked with are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, that their entire life were told that they were told was right on how to parent a child and how to discipline a child. But then they come to America and the standard is different, and they don't want to risk their citizenship. They don't want to risk being sent back to their country because they did something wrong. So they ask me, how do you discipline a child and not punish them? In various different ways they do this. Sorry, my screen just froze for some reason. Can you guys still hear me?
Mhm.
I feel like this has to happen at least once, right? In a Zoom call. But yeah, so I feel like once you understand a little bit of the culture that they're coming from, the refugee process, then you can help put that into practical context. It's put parenting into a practical context, specifically fathering, right? Understanding that helping your clients from many different avenues, from different ways of displaying that in America, we believe that, at least on paper, that discipline means learning, teaching, right? Instructing, right? Punishment is not what we associate, especially physical punishment, is not what we associate with parenting, right? And so it's important to show them, like, to have them practice being a teacher of their children, and like a mentor to their children, and or use whatever language they're familiar with, and have them approach their parenting from that perspective. And of course, there's going to be things lost in translation. And so working with certain refugee populations, you might have to try many different avenues until you gain understanding. But one, knowing that helps the process, realizing that things will be at first lost in translation until you find that right way, and it might not always stay that way, and they still might engage in that negative behavior. But it's a process, right? It takes a long time to acculturate. It takes a long time to fully integrate into a culture, and so giving them that time and being aware of the time necessary is really important to working with refugee populations.
Those are really good points. And I think that those are just some, broad points that a lot of folks, I know we have a lot of folks from Head Start settings and from community mental health settings. I think that speaks broader to some of the work that we try to do on kind of instilling the practices of positive discipline and positive behavioral support more broadly. And then, of course, with new immigrant populations or refugee populations, we have, other layers of cultural or language issues to sort of to work with, as we work with parents and kind of supporting the development of their kids in the most positive way. So I think there are some great broader lessons there. This has been super helpful. I want to, folks have specific questions for Ricky. I think we're a small enough group that I think folks can just unmute and ask. So we have time right now for a couple of questions, and then I do want to be able to go into breakout rooms for a little bit of time, so we can think about this work a little deeper in smaller groups. So if folks have any questions, I think that just feel free to unmute and ask, or comments, questions or comments.
I find it very interesting, just the word discipline and how the concepts that come when we hear the word discipline. And I really appreciate you really putting it, understanding that discipline is a lot more than the average person really understands. And the importance to understand what the reason why we're disciplining and what are the best ways in which we can get the results that are not that necessarily that what the parent wants, but the best result for the growth and education of the child.
And it's important to know that the term discipline is derived from the word disciple, right? And it's to learn, right? And so, Jesus had disciples, and what did they learn? They learned how to worship, right? And we want individuals to be lifelong learners, because that makes them more resilient, and that makes them not so fearful in their own lives, right? Fear can become toxic because it is a secondary emotion, right? You usually fear something because you're sad, or because you're worried, or because something else. We don't want fear. Fear is not an effective disciplinary tool longitudinally, right? You're not always going to be afraid. Eventually, your brain only can handle so much fear, right? And so but if you're a lifelong learner, and if you learn that as a child that your parents are here to teach you, then you're more likely to see them as a necessary or needed resource throughout your life, instead of a threat.
So can you say that discipline really is a component of nurturing?
Yes, it's the same thing as being boundaried, right? Being boundaried is a service to yourself and others, right? Because people know what to expect from you. Boundaries are really important in being predictable. Like in the families that I've worked with, I always advocated for the parents to be consistent, predictable, and reliable. And that's always a heavy, like a heavy ask at first. They're like, I can't be consistent, I can't be predictable, and I can't be reliable because nobody has ever shown me how to be that, and I've never had to be that in my life. And then once you throw boundaries into it as the way that you do that, right? You can do this. I can do this, or I can't do that, or I might be able to do this. But narrowing it down to those three things and committing to that makes you consistent, right? It makes you predictable, and it ultimately makes you reliable once you start getting in the habit of maintaining those boundaries, right? It keeps you genuine, it keeps you honest, and establishes trust. And trust is essential to parenting, but also in relationship building in general.
Thank you. Those are some really important insights. And I think Haley had a good comment that, it sounds like this is a baby gate or a car seat, just consistently keeping the child safe when you think of boundaries. So that was a really great point, Haley. I think we had one other question from Stephen. Stephen, do you want to pipe in and ask your question? Oh, okay.
Hi. Yeah. Sometimes I hear this discussion of consequences that kids need to have consequences, but sometimes those consequences feel like punishment. So I just wanted you to help tease those out.
Yeah, it all really is, what is the intended purpose of this consequence, right? Actions, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? We know this, it's science. And so focusing on the reaction, right? They told you to come in when the street lights came on, right? That's when I told you to come in. You didn't. So as a result of that, now I don't feel like I can trust you out in the community to come back when I need you to, right? And so we're going to have to readjust your schedule. And so that consistent schedule that you had, that expectation that you had been violated by your behavior. Fair enough, you had this reason or that reason, but you know what is expected of you, right? And so you violated that relationship, you violated those expectations. So now our relationship is going to change for a period of time till we believe, or I believe, that you have learned your lesson. And then once you've learned your lesson, you'll get it right back. But you have to show us, you have to show me that you have learned that lesson and know that these expectations are important for you as well as for me, right? Because when those street lights come on, I want to see you in the house. That's how I know you're safe. Otherwise, I worry, I get concerned, and then I have to go, then I'll go looking for you because I'm scared that something happened to you, right? And how you convey that, how you relay that really depends on your child. It's subjective. Every child is different. Every time you have a new child, even if it's your 4th, 5th, 19th, you start over. It's a whole new set of downs. Sorry, I'm a football fan, right? But you have to start over because it's an individual, and how they perceive the world is unique, and you'll never see it. You've never seen it before, and you'll never see it again. And so everybody's different, and so you need to be, and that's why you need resiliency in parenting. That's why it's important to stay boundaries. It's important to engage in self-care because it's important to maintain those boundaries. And we want to avoid punishment because the purpose of punishment is to harm, not to learn, not to grow, but to harm, to take away from. And so if you engage in parenting in a way that makes a consequence a punishment, then you're just taking away from yourself, right? And you're taking away from your child, right? And that degrades the relationship moving forward through the lifespan, because the purpose of the hope for every parent is to raise a healthy 35-year-old, right? So you want a healthy and happy 35-year-old, even if they still live in your basement, you want them to be healthy and happy, right? So that's why it's really important to focus on positive discipline and focus on discipline as learning.
Thank you so much, Ricky. Thanks, Stephen, for the question. And I think, I think Ricky did a great job of describing sort of natural consequences in the example he used and how it's kind of idiosyncratic for each child and almost for every situation. And in early childhood, figuring out how to translate that to whatever the situation is, whether it be, a child has pinched their sibling or another child. So what could be the natural consequence for that kind of behavior that lets the child know what the appropriate behavior is as well, and also sort of deals with whatever was underlying to and kind of what a child is showing, like that kind of aggression.
Before you set a consequence, and it's important to model for parents, it's like writing a goal and on their family care plan, right? Or on their goal sheet, whatever it is in your agency. Before you write a goal, it has to be smart, right? So it has to be timely. It has to be, relevant, all of that, and timely. Like it has to be those. And the same thing needs to be for a consequence. You can't just blanketly make consequences because you need to maintain those. And so if it's not a realistic consequence, then you're going to fail. And then the whole system falls apart.
Yeah.
If you just backed up, thought for a second and didn't react, right? And thought of a realistic, a reliable, and a consistent consequence for behavior, then it would be more impactful, right? Because if you're up and down with how a consequence looks and the expectations, then you're inconsistent. And if you're inconsistent, that deems you as not trustworthy.
I see a lot of head nodding. I want to just transition to being able to go into the small group so we can do a little bit more focused work with colleagues. So we want to, I think Eve from NTAC has some breakout rooms set up. I'm going to I'm going to put the questions into the chat box, but we have 3 breakout rooms set up.
Have one. And so that's kind of what we talked about and kind of similarities that were with everybody who spoke in our group.
Yeah, can I touch on that a little bit? Yeah, it's really important to understand fatherhood culture